They assumed he was a suspicious black man with children. But the truth was, he commanded the entire police department. A quiet suburban street on a golden Saturday afternoon. Children laughed as they rode bicycles. Sprinklers clicked. Across manicured lawns, and neighbors tended their gardens. On the surface, it looked like the very definition of the American dream. But for one black family, the dream was interrupted by flashing lights and raised suspicions. Suspicions born, not out of evidence or reason, but out of prejudice. What unfolded that day would not only shake a single household, but also expose the deeply embedded truths about race, bias, and the invisible burdens carried by so many. It began innocently enough. Marcus Williams, a tall man with a calm presence, and a voice that carried authority without effort, was enjoying a rare day off. As the chief of police for the city, his schedule was relentless, filled with meetings, press conferences, and crisis calls at midnight. But that afternoon, he was simply Dad. His wife, Angela, had suggested they take their 2 children, Jordan and Maya, for a walk around the neighborhood before dinner. It was something ordinary families did every day. For Marcus, it was a chance to breathe, to laugh with his kids, to exist outside the uniform. As they strolled hand in hand, Marcus noticed glances, quick, darting looks from porches and windows. He was used to it. Being a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood meant carrying the awareness that eyes followed him, whether he wore his badge or not. But today, he pushed it aside. His daughter giggled as she pointed at a squirrel, darting across the lawn, and his son rode his scooter ahead, carefree and proud. For a fleeting moment, it felt like any other family walk. Unbeknownst to Marcus, one neighbor was dialing 911. Her voice trembled with urgency as she whispered into the phone. "Yes, I'd like to report suspicious activity. A black man is walking, with 2 kids. I don't know if they belong to him. It doesn't look right." Her words, dripping with assumption, painted a picture of danger where there was none. She didn't see a father. She saw a threat, and within minutes, patrol cars were on their way. Marcus first heard the sirens in the distance, faint but growing louder. His instincts, sharpened by years in law enforcement, immediately recognized the approach of squad cars. He glanced at Angela, who met his eyes with a silent question. The children, oblivious, continued their playful chatter. But Marcus felt the air change. The peaceful stroll was about to turn into something else entirely. The first cruiser screeched to a stop, a few feet away. 2 officers jumped out, hands resting on their holsters. Their voices were sharp, commanding. "Sir, step away from the children!" The words pierced the calm like a blade. Jordan froze on his scooter, confusion spreading across his face. Maya clutched her mother's leg, wide-eyed. Angela's heart raced as she instinctively shielded her children. Marcus raised his hands slowly, deliberately, the way he had advised countless young men to do in Know Your Rights workshops. His voice remained steady, though anger simmered beneath the surface. "Officers, these are my children. This is my family." But the officers didn't lower their guard. One repeated, louder this time. "Step away from the children now." In that moment, Marcus felt the cruel weight of irony. Here he was, the highest-ranking officer in the department, the man responsible for training these very officers, the one who held press conferences about community trust and racial sensitivity, being treated like a suspect in front of his family. He wanted to shout, to tear open the thin veil of ignorance that clouded their judgment. But instead, he did what survival demanded. He stayed calm. Angela's voice broke through the tension. "This is my husband. He is the police chief. You've made a mistake." The words hung in the air, but the officers hesitated, disbelief written across their faces. One of them muttered into his radio, clearly seeking confirmation. Seconds felt like hours. The children clung to their parents, watching the unfolding scene with a mix of fear and confusion that no child should ever have to endure. Finally, the radio crackled back with a confirmation. The transformation was immediate and jarring. The officers' tense posture softened, their voices lowered. "Chief Williams, we're sorry. We received a call about suspicious activity. We didn't realize—" Their words trailed off, empty and fragile, but the damage had already been done. Jordan, only 8 years old, asked the question that broke Marcus's heart. "Daddy, why did they think you were bad?" Maya, still clinging to Angela, whispered, "Were they going to take you away?" These were questions no parent should have to answer, yet questions Black parents across America are forced to confront every day. Marcus looked at his children, then at the officers standing before him. He saw not just two men caught in an awkward mistake, but a system that had failed, again. A system that taught neighbors to fear his skin, that trained officers to escalate before they questioned, that required him to carry both his badge and his dignity as armor against assumptions that could kill. He let out a breath, controlled and deliberate. "This," he said quietly but firmly, "is exactly what I've been trying to change." His words were not for the officers alone. They were for his children, for his neighbors watching from behind curtains, for every person who had ever been reduced to suspicion because of the color of their skin. That night, as the family sat around their dinner table, the conversation lingered heavy in the air. Angela tried to reassure the children, reminding them that their father was respected, that he protected the community. But Marcus knew the truth was more complicated. Respect in uniform did not erase suspicion from it. Authority did not erase prejudice. Titles did not erase the instinctive fear some carried when they saw a Black man, no matter his achievements. He thought back to his childhood, walking with his father in a different neighborhood, facing the same suspicious stares. Decades had passed, yet the script remained the same. The generational weight pressed on him. His children now carried questions he once asked at their age. Questions about why the world saw them differently. Why they had to prove their belonging over and over again. For Marcus, the incident was more than a personal insult. It was a mirror reflecting the very issues he had sworn to confront as chief of police. The policies, the training sessions, the community outreach, none of it mattered if the culture beneath remained unchanged. He knew this story would spread. Neighbors would whisper. The department would feel embarrassed. But Marcus didn't want pity, nor did he want quiet apologies. He wanted accountability. He wanted transformation. He wanted his children to grow, up in a world where a walk down the street wasn't a battlefield of assumptions. The following Monday, Marcus stood before a press conference. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward, and the community gathered to hear his words. He began not as a chief, but as a father. This weekend, I was walking with my family in my neighborhood. A neighbor assumed I looked suspicious. Officers responded, not knowing the man they approached was the chief of police. But here's the truth. It should not matter who I am. No father should have to raise his hands in front of his children just to prove his innocence. His voice was steady, but the weight of his words pressed into the room. He described the fear on his daughter's face, the question from his son, the instinctive leap from assumption to suspicion to confrontation, and then he looked directly into the cameras, his message for the city and beyond. If this can happen to me, imagine what it means for every Black man, woman, and child who does not carry a badge or a title. Imagine the fear, the humiliation, the danger they face. This is not about one neighbor or one call. This is about us, about who we are and who we choose to be. The silence that followed was thick, almost sacred. Marcus knew not everyone would understand. Some would dismiss it as an overreaction. Others would whisper that the neighbor meant well. But for those who listened, truly listened, his Words lit a fire that could not be easily extinguished, and for his children, who sat in the front row watching their father, it was a lesson in courage. They had seen him reduced to suspicion, but they also saw him rise, not with anger, but with truth, not with vengeance, but with vision. Yet deep inside, Marcus also knew the fight was only beginning. The days following Marcus's press conference rippled through the community like waves hitting every shore. Some neighbors, shaken by the revelation, knocked on his door to apologize, their voices full of excuses. "We didn't know it was you," or "She probably overreacted." But Marcus wasn't looking for apologies. He was looking for recognition. That the problem wasn't about his identity as police chief, but about what his skin color meant to people who didn't know his title. At the same time, the story spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news picked it up first, then regional outlets, and eventually, national attention landed on the incident. Headlines read, "Police chief stopped by his officers after 911 call." Commentators debated it on TV, some framing it as an unfortunate mistake, others as a glaring example of systemic bias. Social media erupted with hashtags, each post amplifying the disbelief and outrage. Angela watched the coverage with mixed emotions. On one hand, she was proud that her husband's truth was being heard. On the other, she hated that their children's innocence had been pierced so publicly. At bedtime, when Maya asked if the officers were still mad at Daddy, Angela wrapped her arms tightly around her daughter. "No, baby," she whispered. "They just didn't see Daddy for who he is. But now they know. And more people will know too." Marcus, however, wasn't satisfied with the story ending there. He knew that. Incidents like his happened daily to men and women who didn't wear his badge, whose names would never trend online. He carried their weight with him, every face, every story he had heard during his career. Black fathers handcuffed in front of their kids, young men questioned for walking home, mothers forced to explain to their children why they were treated as suspects. This was bigger than one neighborhood, one phone call, or one awkward apology. So he turned his humiliation into a call for systemic change. Within weeks, Marcus organized a department-wide training. Not the shallow kind that checked boxes, but a rigorous ongoing commitment to confronting implicit bias. He brought in community leaders, sociologists, and families who had lived through similar experiences. The room was filled with officers, some defensive, some uncomfortable, many quiet as they listened to stories that mirrored Marcus's own, only without his authority to shield him. One powerful moment came when a young black man named Terrence stood before the officers and said, "When I was 16, I was stopped walking home from school. I was told I fit the description." I remember standing there, books in my hand, thinking, "What description? I'm not a suspect. I'm just me." But you know what the worst part was? My little sister was watching. She saw me treated like a criminal before she even knew what that word meant. His voice cracked, and the silence that followed was heavy with truth. Marcus watched his officers' faces. Some shifted uncomfortably, others bowed their heads. For him, it wasn't about shaming them, it was about opening eyes. If he, as chief, could be reduced to suspicion in front of his children, then the urgency of change could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, the neighbor who made the 911 call remained quiet for days. Then, one evening, she showed up at the Williams household, wringing her hands. Her apology was halting, awkward. I didn't know. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood." Marcus listened, his expression steady but unreadable. When she finished, he responded calmly. "You weren't protecting the neighborhood. You were protecting an idea, a dangerous one, that people like me don't belong. My family belongs here. Every family like mine belongs here. That's what you need to understand." She left in tears, but Marcus hoped her tears weren't just for embarrassment, but for recognition. Jordan, ever curious, asked his father later that night, "Daddy, will people always think we don't belong?" Marcus took a deep breath. He knew the weight of that question. It could not be brushed aside with simple reassurances. "Son," he said, "some people will see us that way, yes, but that doesn't mean we stop walking. It doesn't mean we stop living. Our job is to stand tall, to keep showing the world who we are, until the truth becomes louder than their fear." Angela smiled faintly at her husband's words, but she also knew the burden he carried. Being both chief and black father meant living in two worlds that often collided, each demanding strength, patience, and resilience. Yet she also saw how this incident had ignited something deeper in him, a determination not just to manage a department, but to reshape it. Months passed, and Marcus's department began to change. Policies shifted, training expanded, and the community saw an unprecedented level of transparency. Reports of unnecessary stops decreased, and complaints of racial profiling were investigated with seriousness rather than dismissal. It wasn't perfect, progress never was, but it was a start. And that start was rooted in a single humiliating moment that Marcus refused to let go to waste. National leaders in law enforcement invited him to speak at conferences. In one keynote address, Marcus recounted the story of that day. But instead of focusing on his title, he focused on his children. "The real story," he told the audience, "isn't that officers stopped a police chief. The real story is that two kids saw their father treated like a stranger in his neighborhood. And if you think that doesn't matter, you're not listening. Because children remember. They remember the fear. They remember the confusion. And they remember whether justice showed up or if it didn't." His words resonated far beyond the room, quoted in newspapers and replayed on television. But perhaps the most profound impact was at home. Jordan began writing essays at school about fairness and justice, his young voice already echoing his father's passion. Maya, too, would tell her friends proudly, "My daddy is the chief. He helps people see what's right." The incident, that once left them shaken, was slowly being reshaped into a lesson in courage, pride, and dignity. One evening, months after the incident, Marcus walked again with his family through the same neighborhood. This time, the stares were different. Some neighbors waved, others smiled cautiously. And while he knew not all hearts had changed, he felt a shift, a recognition, however small, that his family belonged without question. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus thought of the journey still ahead, for his family, for his department, for every black family in America. He knew bias couldn't be erased overnight. But he also knew the power of persistence, the strength of truth spoken out loud, and the dignity of standing tall even when the world tried to shrink you. That night, as he tucked his children into bed, Jordan whispered, "Daddy, I'm glad you didn't let them scare you." Marcus kissed his son's forehead and replied, "That's the lesson, son. We never let fear write our story. We write it ourselves." And so, what began as a neighbor's call meant to strip dignity away instead became a defining moment of resilience. A reminder that suspicion may try to follow black lives, but dignity, courage, and truth will always rise higher. Because at the end of the day, Marcus Williams was more than a chief of police, more than the man his neighbors once doubted. He was a father, a husband, a leader, and above all, a man whose very existence stood as testimony that no assumption, no prejudice, no whispered suspicion could erase his worth. And that is the story his children would carry forward, not of fear but of pride, not of silence but of voice, not of shame but of strength.